5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm Zoe Bailey.
And I'm Josh Barker.
Coming up today, the UK Space Agency is being scrapped. But is it? We dig into this headline and ask, what does the UK actually do in space? But first, space wows. Josh, do you want to start us off?
I do indeed, and this week my space wow is that JUICE, the European Space Agency mission on its way to Jupiter in the outer solar system, has arrived at Venus.
That seems... You wanna unpack that?
It's not the right direction, is it? If anybody remembers their solar system from back at school or exploring lovely science books, yeah, you'll notice that Venus is in the inner solar system, closer to the sun than we are, whereas Jupiter is obviously much further. So a probe that's heading out there probably shouldn't be going inwards. But actually, this is all part of the plan. They've not gone wrong. They didn't turn, take the wrong exit of the interstellar roundabout or whatever it was. This is all part of a complex set of orbital manoeuvres, this pathway that the spacecraft is following to pick up speed. As we head further out into our solar system to reach the outer planets, our spacecraft actually has to travel much faster. It has to gain energy to beat the pull of the sun's gravity. Now, you could do that via engines. That's expensive. They need fuel and things like that. Or we can use slingshotting around planets. So what's happening is the spacecraft has flown into the inner solar system, used the sun's gravity to speed up, and it's swinging around Venus to loop its way out towards Jupiter. And it's just done that. So just this week, it arrived and swung around Venus and has started that next part of its journey.
That's super exciting. And these sort of flyby slingshot maneuvers are super common, especially the further out you're going as well.
They are, and you often do more than one, which is in fact what JUICE is doing. So its destination after getting to Venus isn't going to Jupiter. Its next destination is back actually here at Earth. So despite having taken off a couple of years ago, it's coming back to Earth next year, at which point it will swing around our planet, loop a bit further into the solar system. It will then return back to Earth in 2029 before finally looping all the way out to arrive at Jupiter in 2031. So a complex path, lots of these delicate manoeuvres, but essentially it means it can get there using very minimal fuel, being super efficient, meaning we can pack it full of science experiments rather than just engines and fuel tanks.
Yeah, absolutely, which is so important because it's so expensive to get things going. But I think it does cause quite a lot of stress if you've got to get through all of these flyby manoeuvres. So I have to say, I think I'm probably glad I'm not in mission control for each of these, 10 years of your life. Slingshot manoeuvres.
What about yours? I think yours is close to home, if I've heard the rumours correctly.
Well, I have kind of wanting to pick up on one of my hobbies and bring that in. So I really like sewing, knitting, crafting, that sort of stuff. So I kind of wanted to talk about that and how it's relevant to space. Because I think...
Is it?
It is.
Excellent. Okay, good start.
So I think maybe if you're sort of asked to put those two... Well, if you were asked to put those two things together, what would you think? How might sewing help you in space?
I mean,
what would you first go to?
I guess fabric and textiles, maybe spacesuits. I know that there was origami experts that worked on the James Webb Space Telescope, so maybe there's a technique in knitting, or is it more that textiles?
So the spacesuits is obviously a good go-to, right? It's a suit, it's a kind of item clothing, and I think people often think of them, and maybe the most well-known sort of space seamstresses, maybe you could call them, would be the team that worked on the Apollo astronaut suits, and they sadly didn't get a lot of recognition at the time. Another reason why I'd love to talk about it. But they were a group of women from, sort of working class backgrounds. A lot of them were black and from minority ethnic groups that had these amazing experience and skills in pattern cutting, in seamstressing and all of this. And so they were brought on with a company that was making the suits for the Apollo astronauts. And they used all of that knowledge and know-how to cut these kind of really unique fabrics as well, and stuff that they might not have seen before. Things like the rubber layers to keep the pressure, the sort of mylar layers for insulation and everything, and really put all of that together to come up with these spacesuits that literally kept those astronauts alive.
Yeah, I guess when you think about space and technology, you often think of coming up with new and exciting things and inventing things. But actually, most of the time, most of the work's done is, I guess, stuff that we do all the time. Like you say, clothes manufacturing we've been doing for a long, long time. And there's these people that are experts that, why reinvent it? Bring in people that know what they're doing. So
Absolutely.
That's a cool story.
And it's a great thing that shows sort of how important everyone in the team is, right? Because there's a few times where like the suit was broken just a day or so before launch. Like if that doesn't work, you can't go, the mission can't complete, right? And it doesn't matter that you've got all your astronauts and, I don't know, mathematicians and whatever ready, but if you don't have someone come in and fix that suit, you also can't
It's
do
not
the
the reason
mission.
you don't want to go to space, is it?
Yeah.
Put a hole in your knee or something.
Yeah. So that sort of really got me interested in why, like, how can these things come together? And I've been really lucky, and I've sort of ended up chatting with a few other people that kind of crossed these paths as well. So I think we might talk about it a little bit later, but I've been really lucky to visit Harwell, Rouse Space and things over there. And I actually got to chat to the team there that work on making multi-layer insulation.
Okay, that's
MLI.
the shiny layers that you get on the outside of spacecraft, right?
Yeah, if you've seen a picture of a satellite, you've probably been looking, at least in some part, at that multi-layer insulation. It's those almost sort of like little jackets of gold that go round. So again, that is an expert team of seamstresses with lots of experience, sort of technicians, engineers, crafters and makers to make these sorts of things. And I also met somebody a few years ago at one of our events here, UK and Space Festival, the National Space Centre. Really good. She did an amazing talk. She was from Oxford Space Systems, and she was like a textile technician, and she worked on the knitting team.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess it's nice to see that those things are still happening now, and are still super important, and also happening here. Which is,
and I think also, like, this was a really good example of something that's really a bit different from, like, you know, thinking clothes. So they actually make knitted mesh with metal yarn that they knit
interesting.
for antenna for satellites.
Right. I guess, I guess big radar antennas. I know we saw the biomass mission has that big antenna umbrella, so I guess maybe something similar to that.
Yeah, so it's actually that they can make tubes without there being seams, and that's like a uniquely knitting technique. So it was these people that had knitting and textiles background that could help with that.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Let's get into our main topic today. We're talking about UK Space Agency and what the UK does in space. So send this to someone who's interested in a career in space. We've seen headlines recently. The UK Space Agency, the BBC said, is being scrapped. Space.com, I think, said is being eliminated. Some strong words there. But we also had the government saying actually it was cutting red tape, it was making it efficient as part of this plan for change. So let's dig into that, what that actually means. And I think actually would be a good place to start is what is the UK Space Agency, because we've been talking about space agencies here over summer, and my team's been really interested to find out that actually the first time a lot of our visitors have even ever heard of the UK Space Agency is here when they visited us. So do you want to share a little bit, anything you think is important about UK Space Agency?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when people think of space, they obviously always think of places like NASA. You know, some people might have heard of ESA, the European Space Agency, but very few people realise that we have a space agency here in the UK, and it's really useful. What it does is it acts as sort of the government department that sort of manages what the UK does in space. So they don't do the space stuff themselves. They're not building and launching rockets or analysing scientific data, but they're the organisational group that work on behalf of the government to sort of help structure and instruct what all the science industry of the UK should do. So that might be, I don't know, setting a strategy to say, hey, we're going to work on this type of science for the next few years, and that's going to be one of the areas we're going to focus on. And they'll sort of set that out and help people get in that direction. They also look after the money. So, you know, you've got to have money to fund these projects and all these exciting things. Well, that comes from the government, and the UK Space Agency receive a portion of that budget, and they can then say, well, we're going to give, you know, so many pounds to launching rockets, and so many to sponsoring scientists, and so many to working on big international projects. They look after that, but they're really the organisational structure that help guide and shape what we do as a nation when it comes to exploring space and science.
Yeah, and my understanding is historically that's been really closely linked with ESA as well. Like a lot of our funding has gone to those joint projects with the European Space Agency, including and up to sort of, you know, astronauts. We've had astronauts trained through that program as well. But there's lots of stuff that happens obviously here at home as well, and sort of independently here. So, I mean, we're really good at quite a lot of things in space. We meaning the UK, that I think a lot of people don't know about. The one that I always think of is sort of satellites. we're really good at satellites.
We're probably one of the best at satellites.
Yeah.
It really is still underselling it.
Yeah.
For a long time, the UK has probably been, I would argue, perhaps the leading country in terms of science, satellite design, construction, manufacture, building and operation. This is something that we've done for, decades at this point, over 40, 50 years in some cases for some organisations. And I think, that's another role of the Space Agency, is really to celebrate and sort of push that to help give these access to companies and organisations to help share those expertise, but really highlight them as well. So, satellite manufacturing all over the country, we find it. So a really famous example of that is Surrey Satellite Technology Limited. So they're based down around Surrey, and they've been building satellites for about 30 to 40 years, I think, at this point, at an incredibly high level, often constructing satellites for other countries and other nations and other missions. But we also have other things as well. So they build traditionally the very large satellites that we see. If you go to the other end of the country, in Scotland, we've got companies like Clyde Space that are absolute experts in these micro CubeSat satellites. These are satellites that are 10 centimetres cubed and have really completely changed how nations, how people, organisations access space. Massively brought down the cost, and they're really leading the way in how you build those, how you design those, how you use them to do really, really useful science.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also not just the building of the satellites, but it's kind of everything that goes around it. You kind of touched on a few things there as well. The thing my mind goes to is the National Satellite Testing Facility, which again, I've been very lucky and I was able to go there. They actually had one of the Earth Explorers there to be tested in it. So it's not even just, UK satellites that get tested there. They get shipped in from other countries as well, because we really are very good at satellites.
Yeah, and that's another one of those hubs. So that's based over in Harwell in Oxford, and like you say, it's a huge facility that supports the testing and manufacturing of this hardware. Make sure it's going to survive once it gets up into space. And like you say, once we as a nation have that capability, we can use it for our own things, but also we can support the global industry and say, hey, we've got this facility, come along, use what we've got, we can help you out using our expertise. And again, that's what the UK Space Agency is for. They're out there working with those other nations, bringing in those partnerships to help support RAL Space and the companies that are based in Harwell to make sure they've got those connections and the support they need.
Yeah, I think that also links in really well to something else I think we're really good at, which is like instrumentation. And often a spacecraft will carry lots of different instruments, right? You want to collect as much data as you can in a single
Especially
mission.
the big ones, yeah.
Exactly. Especially if it's like juice that is got to take many flybys to get there.
There's many, 10, 20 experiments that are all part of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we're really good at instrumentation. And we've had lots of stuff, especially sort of from Leicester, that's been on some of these really big missions you'd have heard of, maybe not knowing that some of those core scientific components are based and built from around here and experts.
Yeah, and I think that's that story to tell, is that we're really good at science. We're a good nation that's done a lot of science for a long time. We've got a long history, hundreds of years of world-leading science in all sorts of areas, not just space, happens here in the UK. And that's partly because we've got these organisations that can support them. But you're quite right, space is an area that we've done a lot. Local to here in Leicester, we've had things that have been built and operated in space since the 1960s. And that's all sorts of experiments. So whether that's large, complicated experiments like the MIRI instrument that's on the James Webb Space Telescope, which we were a really big part of with a lot of other nations. So we worked with Germany and Italy to bring together technologies to do that. Or instruments that were built entirely here, like the MIX instrument, which is on a mission called Bepi Colombo. And that's going to use X-rays to investigate Mercury. And so that was something that uses our expertise. But again, we're just one centre across this whole nation. I think that's always one of the really nice things that I know I enjoy sharing with visitors when they are exploring our galleries, to say space is something that we can do in the UK. We do have an agency that helps support that because we're really good at it, and it happens all over the place in all sorts of different corners of the country and the nation. We find these things happening.
Yeah, and I think it links back to one of the things that I love most about space and the space sector is that it brings all these different people and expertises together. An expertise that I was surprised to hear actually we're quite leading in was one you told me about before, which is that we're really good at regulation, space regulation.
Yeah, it sounds really dull unless you're a lawyer and love this sort of stuff. But yeah, this is something that's really been coming into the forefront recently. For a long time, it was just nations and governments doing space. space, and that meant that we had this really strong international framework of law. Countries have got quite robust laws of how they interact and deal with each other, and there's a problem, how do you resolve that? But as we've seen space change, we've talked about mainly companies here in the UK that are doing all the space activities. Well, suddenly they have a hugely different relationship. The laws that we have for space, which were set up in the 60s and 70s, don't really apply to how we're using space nowadays. But the UK is another area that we've got a really long legal system. As a nation, we've got a long history. That comes with a long history of laws. And so we're looked at across the world as a really good place to look at how we work these things through, how do we structure our regulations, and how we can apply that. So yeah, we're really leading the way, in particular, in a new area of space, which is all about missions interacting. So we've got, as we're trying to be more sustainable in space, one of the things we want to do is repair satellites. If a satellite breaks while it's in space, it becomes space junk. That can be a danger to astronauts that are up there or the missions. And so there's a really big market starting to arrive of saying, well, maybe I can build a satellite that can rendezvous with yours and maybe fix your solar panels for you because they got broken, or refuel you so you can extend your mission. Now that sounds great, but the idea of getting satellites close to each other, especially if there are different countries or different organisations, that gets lots of people nervous.
And if something goes wrong, it's good to be prepared for how to deal with that in advance.
Yeah, exactly right. Space is a high energy environment, and something goes slightly wrong and suddenly your spacecraft's smashed together and, well, hang on a minute, I had a satellite that was sort of working and you destroyed it. What do we do?
Yeah.
So we're working really hard on those laws at the moment. So space sustainability, I mentioned, that's another area that the UK is really trying to lead and push forwards to create a good framework of how do we do this responsibly. If we're all going to be using space, how do we make sure it stays clear and safe and useful for everyone while still being able to be used for space travel and things like that. But yeah, that's definitely another area that we really work hard on and we're actually doing really good work in.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I always think about how uniting space and space exploration is, at least for me.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, and maybe it's because we don't have the regulations yet, but, space is kind of accessible to all of us. It's not been divided up into our countries or anything like that. It's a new frontier for every human on the planet. So I think in that way it can be really uniting. But it is also sometimes, I think about it being a bit like a Wild West of, we haven't quite worked out the regulations for this yet. So yeah, it's really cool to hear that we're leading on that. And I think it helps us tackle those bigger problems as well.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's it. It's about making sure that this is an environment and a resource that we can use to support us, but it's not being dominated, by the first people to get there. Because I think that can also be, different nations are at different points. Some aren't interested in space at the moment, but they might be in the future. And should they be penalised for being late to space? Well, not really. And so having, a good structure for how that works is something that we're really trying to work on and try and support. And answering those big questions is another area that we do a lot. So, for example, looking back down at the Earth, when we think of space, we often think of the cool galaxies and exciting missions to Jupiter or beyond. But actually, a huge amount of space work is done looking back down at the Earth, whether that's something as simple as a weather forecast or whether that's, missions monitoring piracy in the seas or looking for deforestation or the changes or impacts on our environment or our climate. And that's something that we do really well here in the UK as well. In fact, just up the road in Space Park Leicester, one of the space clusters that we have scattered across the UK to focus on some of these activities, we have an organisation called the National Centre for Earth Observation. And that's a huge network of over 200 scientists that focus on understanding and using space to study our planet and our environment.
Yeah, and they're great at collecting data from satellites from countries all across the world, right?
Yeah,
and again,
and sharing it with those countries as well. So many of the projects that they're working on involve not just UK companies, organisations, people, but it's looking across the globe at how they can support.
Yeah, it's a great way. Space is a great way of being able to be in the UK, but actually help solve a problem that is somewhere completely different over the other side of the world, especially with Earth observation. So yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think we have such strengths that maybe people don't always realise.
But I think it's because it doesn't necessarily always there's lots of these things that don't often end up in the headlines. We talk about exploring the headlines here on this podcast, but it takes, if you're interested in science, we know where to go, and you can find this, whether that's a website or a news outlet or, a blog that talks about these things. But often these things don't always come straight through into the mainstream, which is fine. Not everyone's interested. I think space is fascinating, and hopefully you do if you're listening at home. But actually, it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But it's also nice to sometimes be able to take these opportunities and say, this is what's happening. This is how we're helping. This is what we're good at. This is where we work with other people to really celebrate that. And I think that's why, we come back to that headline that sort of kicked off this conversation, is that I was a little bit disappointed to see some of the reporting around what's happening to the UK Space Agency.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I saw was really quite sensational, I suppose. So it would be good to break down, what does it mean? Is it being scrapped? What is happening there? All this great stuff we've just talked about, is it suddenly going away?
Thankfully, no. It's not just, we're not going to get to the end of the month and we turn off the space agency, lock the doors, and that's it. We don't do anything. Actually, like you say, it feels very sensationalised. Like you say, I think the BBC used the word scrapped, and we've seen eliminated, and will we not do any? And actually, the story is actually really dull. There's not really that much that's ultimately changing. So what happens is we have these government departments, and the one that we're going to talk about a lot today is called DSIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And what that is, well, suddenly if you start to think about it, well, space kind of sounds like it fits within that category. It's science and innovation and technology. But for a long time, the Space Agency was a separate organisation. So it was treated as a separate department that answered straight to the governmental ministers and sort of was independent. It got to make its own decisions, based a little bit off what the government suggested, but kind of ran itself. What this announcement has said is that that's going to end, and they're actually going to move the UK Space Agency into this Department for Science, Technology and Innovation, into DSIT. Now, that's not actually a huge, big change. Technically, if you look at the layout of our government, the UK Space Agency already sits in there. It's just allowed to operate completely independently without having to answer to their management structure, so to speak.
So there's not as big as a change as maybe some of the things we'll say, but it sounds like with any change, there may be a bit of positive, maybe a bit of negative. I guess it sounds like maybe that they're losing a bit of independence on what they can do.
Yeah, definitely.
But maybe a really big positive, the one that comes to my mind is, does it mean that we might have more integration with how space can help all sorts of sectors of science and technology? Because I think, again, that's what we've shown today, right? Like, we really want to show that we can use space in almost every facet of life.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think you will see a bit of change. I think that the most immediate changes is going to happen at the tops of the organisation. Now they are responding and responsible to essentially the managers. So if you were a previous manager of the UK Space Agency, unfortunately, that probably means you're going to have some duplication, and that might mean that there are a few jobs being closed there. What was really key in the announcement from the government around this was they weren't looking immediately at reducing the size, so they've not massively cut the funding. There are no immediate plans to sack a bunch of people or anything like that. There's no programs being cancelled. So obviously we talked in the podcast a few months ago about how NASA's changed, and that has seen a dramatic reduction. That hasn't happened, I will say, yet. There isn't any plans to, but you never know. These things can always change going forwards. But at the moment, the idea is to move them together, to be a bit more efficient, to help that working together. So it cuts down on having too many people managing when you only perhaps need a couple. And also, like you say, better integration. If they're doing science and technology stuff, well, so are the space agencies. So maybe if we do that science and technology stuff together, that might be a little bit more efficient.
Yeah, a bit more integrated and working together. And maybe the fact that we're great at regulations can help with this, making things more efficient.
Yes, definitely.
Hopefully. So yeah, I think that will be, hopefully it'll be a good thing.
I think there's possibilities for it. And I think like you say, that integration is really nice. One of the really nice things about space as an industry, especially here in the UK, is it's done really, really well. If you look back over all the really boring governmental reports about our economy and which bits are doing well, space has been doing well for best part of a decade, even during tough times like we had the pandemic, we've had little mini recessions, and in some areas the economy has struggled. Space has always been an area that if we put money into it, we get a lot more money back out, and it does really good things. It creates jobs, it allows people to do new skilled work and learn things, and it's an area that tends to grow more than it costs us as a nation to get in. And so hopefully we'll see a lot of that support coming through this governmental department. it's not like it's a department that's shrinking and on its way out, and so we're going to push it into this one so that we can quietly get rid of it. I think what this might be is to say, this is doing really well, can we use that to help boost the rest of this organisation? That's what I'd like to think is part of the reasoning for this.
I'm always a little nervous, like when something like this happens, like, is it a way to slowly move into, like, I don't know, reducing something or something like that? And like you say, we never know, but I think you're totally right. Like, the space industry has only kind of been thriving, so it would be a surprise to me if they wanted to move away from that.
I think so, and you only have to talk about some of the recent things we're up to. You know, we've talked about some of the recent big missions that we're involved in. The UK Science is still doing really well. UK Space is doing really well. You mentioned astronauts at the, as one of the things. Yeah. This is something that, again, in the most recent European set of astronaut selections, the UK was really lucky and has almost been overrepresented. We've got an astronaut candidate, we've got a reserve astronaut, and we've got a UK national as part of a new programme looking at opening access to people with less physical ability and changing the requirements of getting into space. So we're really quite overrepresented almost in that national picture of what space is doing, which I think it has to be a good sign. You don't take something that's doing really well and merge it to get rid of, which has happened. And I think that might be where that sensationalism and a bit of that doomerism crept in. This usually happens for departments that aren't doing well. And like you say, they're quietly trying to find a way to slowly get rid of it. I don't think that's what's happening with space.
I hope not either. I think maybe people are also on edge, like, especially you mentioned the NASA budget. Like, we have heard across the world of things getting cut, so I think maybe it's made everybody a little bit like, ooh, is this going to be that? But yeah, I'm hopeful it's not that either. So every episode we like to bring you a way to engage with space, and today we can recommend you our UK in Space Festival, which is coming up on the 14th of September.
Yeah, so a real good chance to come down and learn about what the UK is up to in space. We've got a whole host of experts and talks and activities to really showcase. Have you got any activities that got your interest?
I want to see and do everything. But I am really interested in space debris, or more specifically what we're going to do about space debris, and we've got a really interesting sounding talk that I'm really keen to go to hear about what we could do maybe to help with that. Anything catch your eye?
So there's a lady called Daisy Richardson who took part in a competition based around CanSats. So these are small satellites that fit in a drinks can. And I know this is a programme that they do with young students, sixth formers and things like that, as a chance to give them a chance to do some real spacecraft engineering. They then get to test and launch them. And so I'm really fascinated to hear about her experience. I believe she even won the competition. So and it helped her really get her start to space. So I'm really interested to see that sort of different way into getting hands-on and involved.
Yeah, I helped with one of the launch events for CanSat a few years ago, and it was so amazing to see these teams these teams of students that had come up with such creative ways of doing things, and seeing them succeed fully, or even if it's partly, and learn that whole sort of scientific method and what they could do. It's amazing. So it would be really nice to hear a personal story of how it's impacted someone. So I think that would be really good. So if you have any interest in a space career or in what the UK is doing in space, then we highly recommend you join us for UK in Space Festival. Make sure you find out the information in the description.
So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Space Now podcast. As always, we would love to hear your questions and comments, so do get in touch at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. See you soon!